record on this. All right, I think we're recording right now. All right, great. So once again, welcome to session number 2 of our case prep series, and let's get started. So, just like session 1, one thing that we should do first is, there we go. A little bit of an interactive section where we basically do our initial pitch about ourselves. Typically, when you're getting started with an interview, one of the first, typical questions that you're getting asked, just, basically to start a rapport between yourself and the interviewer, is, a very typical question. Tell me about yourself. Or in other words, another one would be, walk me through your resume. They're basically the same, question either way or statement either way. But if the name is already apparent between yourself and the interviewer, typically what they're looking for is, you talking about yourself, why you chose your field of study, and then like why that field of study.
A diverse and inclusive culture within the firm. But
what was that? There's a question? Okay. And then you talk about your field of study, but then from there, what you're looking to do is tie that into, why consulting. A lot of us are either masters or PhD students. And, especially as a PhD student, when you're going from, that kind of study to consulting, it's a change in industries. So a lot of what's really important when you're talking about yourself is basically spinning it to where, you're showing, basically all the value that you actually offer for the firm, given that you're going from, PhD work to consulting. And there's a lot of things about, going from PhD or master's work to consulting that you really bring to the firm. For example, I myself am a PhD candidate. So, a lot of my work is hypothesis driven, right? That's pretty apparent. And, when you're doing your casing, it's a hypothesis driven approach. So you already have this, frame of mind that you've been training yourself all this time that you can actually translate very well into the consulting industry. And beyond that, though, the work that you're solving is very niche, and it's usually problems that have never been tackled before within your respective industries. And especially with consulting, the reason why you're brought in the first place, these are very high level problems that you're solving for your clientele. And there's a lot of value you're bringing either as a master's student or a PhD student, given the nature of the work that you've been doing in the first place. And while doing all this, what's important is, kind of presenting what makes you unique, the value they bring as an individual, not just, the work that you're doing given your studies. And, when it comes to your pitch, what's pretty important is, basically telling a great story while you're at it. So, your resume in a lot of ways is a story. And while you're pitching yourself, that's a story as well. And, it's nice to, be professional, but also be very friendly while you're doing this too. So it's kind of passing the airport test where you have a good rapport between your interviewer and yourself. And then, after this session, where you kind of do your pitch and there's a little bit of behavioral interviews going back and forth, just depends on the interview format. That's when you transition to doing cases. So with that in mind, let's take, a minute, maybe like 30 seconds to kind of on your own, think about how you do your initial pitch, no more than a minute, maybe like 45 seconds or so. And then maybe we can have a few examples, just volunteers from there. So I'm going to give you all, 38 seconds to kind of think through your pitch, and then I'll ask for volunteers. All right then. Does anyone want to, do a practice pitch or example pitch? That's okay. So, and it, you know, typically with my initial pitch before interview, I would say it's about, maybe 2 to 3 minutes in length. I'm not going to do a whole one. I'm just going to do a fast version of one. Uh, but a lot of what I do with my initial pitch, when I'm introducing myself, is to answer a lot of questions that the interviewer may have before, they have a chance to ask. So, interviewer may ask initially, do you mind walking me through your resume? I'm like, sure, thank you. And I ask, maybe a little bit of clarifying how they want the scope of, how I walk them through the resume to be. But then I usually say something along the lines of, if I had to describe myself, based off of what you see through my resume, I would describe myself as a very sociable and curious individual. And you see this evident, throughout my entire resume. And then I would start talking about, the work I've done. So like in my undergrad years, I started doing, I'd say, biomechanics, and I start walking through my research history because my resume is very research focused. And then it'll lead up to basically where I am now with my PhD work, and I'm talking about all the research I've done. And then I would say something along the lines of, I really enjoy tackling, the most complex problems in these respective fields, and I'm very passionate about it. One of the things that is cause for concern for me is the fact that the nature of my research, the impact of that work, I won't be seeing 10, 15 years into the future. This is actually how I stumbled upon consulting, because this is something I wanted to do, basically high impact work. And a couple years ago, searched about consulting and actually discovered the field and joined the Carnegie Mellon Graduate Consulting Club as a result. One thing I really like about consulting is not only the fact that you're doing high impact work, but it's also a leadership position. And I have that's been evident all throughout my research or my resume as well. And then from there, I talk about all the leadership positions that I have throughout my resume. This is what led me to consulting, interest in your firm. And then I would say something along the lines of why I'm interested in their firm in particular. And I think that's really important, not only answering the question of why consulting and why you're making this transition from one field to the other, but why you're interested in their firm. And there's a lot of different examples you can use. For example, McKinsey, it could be their clientele. The fact that they have a variety of clients that are high tier clients. It could be the fact that the firm that you've talked to so many people in their firm that they've had very positive things to say about that, and you identify with the culture of their firm, and maybe you can say some things intrinsic to their firm as a result of that. LAK, their casing model or their case teams are very local, so you're not your office space is primarily comprised, the projects that you're on is primarily comprised of everyone that's in your office. So you have a nice work culture as a result of that. Other firms, weekends are protected. Some firms travel, some firms don't. Those are pros or cons depending on who you are as an individual. What this shows is basically, you're really, you've done your research on the firm and why that's the firm that you're interested in the first place. I added a little more time. Does anyone have an example? It doesn't have to be long, maybe like 45 seconds that they would like to try. Or if you have any questions maybe about the pitch.
I can go.
Sounds good.
Okay. So you want me to do the tell me about yourself pitch?
Sure.
Okay. My name is Juliette Krellin, and I'm a first year candidate in a Master's of Science for Public Policy and Management at Carnegie Mellon University. I'm studying public policy and management at Carnegie Mellon because I want to gain the quantitative and analytical and managerial skills to apply to a career in consulting, specifically public sector consulting. I'm interested in public sector consulting after having worked in the public sector at the federal, state, and local level. And now I want to apply these skills to improving the service delivery of the public sector.
That's really good. And I like how that comes full circle. You talk about the work that you've done, how that applies to consulting. why, on some levels, like why you're interested in consulting in the first place. It really answers all those questions, and it shows, personality while you're at it. So that's great. Anyone else? That's great. So let's move on. So I think it's really important that we review some slides from session 1, because this is just the fundamentals of when it comes to casing in the first place. So, what is a case interview? Well, there's 2 major types of case interviews in the first place. There's interviewer-led and there's interviewee-led. And although they're quite similar on many levels, there's certain fundamental differences of, basically how you should be mentally approaching the problem. For interviewer-led cases, this is where you actually have your interviewer asking you direct questions, and it's to your advantage to answer these questions as directly as possible. But not only that, but basically showing the so what from that question with the answer that you have. This is very popular for McKinsey, and McKinsey uses an interviewer-led case style because it's standardized. So there's certain insights that they expect, the bare minimum for everyone to have, and then if you go that extra mile, you think of things that are beyond the rubric, or even the interviewer has never seen before. Those are just bonus points that help you throughout the interview process. The interviewee-led case style is where basically you're given a question. It could be quite simple. It could be something as simple as Mercedes is looking to create a manufacturing plant in France. Should they? And that's the entire prompt. At that point, for the next 30 minutes, you're the driver in the seat, and you're basically guiding, what your hypothesis is, what your framework will be, and what information you need to solve that question over the next 30 minutes. And the interviewer is basically being taken through a ride where you eventually reach to a conclusion for the interviewee-led case format. So very different styles, but at the end of the day, you do come to that same conclusion with basically the insights that you draw along the way throughout the case. Typically speaking, and this varies, firm to firm, but the typical case length would be anywhere between 25 to 35 minutes. For some firms, they're hour-long blocks where you have 30 minutes of behavioral, 30 minutes of the case. Sometimes you have one interviewer that just does behavioral. You have another interviewer that just does the case. And the second you walk into the beginning of the interview, like they just jump right into the case, and you have that 30 minutes, basically before the next interviewer happens to wrap up the case. So, that's typically the time range you want to be shooting for, especially when you're practicing with your partners, basically to finish the case before 30 minutes. Another thing that you may see too, sometimes with the case books, but especially throughout the interview process, is they're going to have a grading rubric, whether it's interviewee or interviewer-led. I would argue that interviewee-led maybe a little, or interviewer-led may be a little more structured with like the exact things they're looking for a given question. For interviewee-led, it may be the insights they were able to draw along the way. And when you're doing cases, there's broad stroke categories, but for every category, it's honestly like a mix and match between the two. You might have a profitability case that may also be a market entry, and then acquisition case that is part of a market entry case. So there's frameworks that fit into all these different types of case interviews. The thing they should always take away with when it comes to frameworks, and we're going to touch on some frameworks, and I added a couple more frameworks that we'll touch on, is that they're a framework that kind of gets you started, and then from there you want to tailor it accordingly, given the case that you have, since every case is pretty unique in and of itself. So yeah, just to kind of go through the list, it's profitability, market entry, acquisition, organization, industry analysis, probably optimization of a process, in that case, market sizing, which is honestly a part of many, many different cases. Some of the less common cases, maybe like a nonprofit. I definitely see that in interview, but definitely still practice those, since that's definitely something that can still come up. I'm sure other people have had that experience in an interview. Capacity expansion, investments. There's a lot of different potential, types of cases that there are. And that's part of the excitement when it comes to consulting in general. You get a chance to basically be exposed to a myriad of different fields, especially starting off before you specialize. Now, given the nature of all these different cases, one of the tools that you have at your disposal is something called a framework. So you start off and you're given a question, should Mercedes-Benz create a manufacturing plant in France? And when you come up with your framework to answer that hypothesis, which maybe your initial hypothesis is Mercedes should create this manufacturing plant, you want to create a framework. And a framework is something where, ideally, it's mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive, where you basically have a number of different ideas that help test our hypothesis. Yes, we should create this manufacturing plant. But each one of these ideas or buckets, as you can call them, basically test a different aspect that at the end of the day is collectively exhaustive and basically testing everything that's worth looking into, whether or not you should create this or have this manufacturing plant. So before I go forward, does anyone have any questions? I did a lot of talking. All right, good. So, probably the most common type of framework there is, you're probably going to use this in like 80% of your frameworks, is the profitability framework, where you're looking at the revenue and the costs, you're trying to improve the profits for your client, and it's worth looking at, all the different aspects of what goes into your revenue and different aspects that go into your costs. And then, when you go beyond that, it's really useful is looking at, maybe it's a volume issue. We need to sell a larger volume. And then now that you have this aspect of your framework of profitability, it may be worth taking inspiration from future frameworks. And, a lot of frameworks, there's a lot of segmentation, just segment, the different types of products you're selling by volume, segment different types of prices there may be, segment the different types of maybe variable costs for respective products that you're selling. So segmentation is very important throughout casing. Probably, I think this is one of the oldest frameworks that have been made. Really old. The 3 C's framework, very popular. Customer, competition, and company. And this is very general and is applied to a lot of different cases. If for those of you who are familiar, there's Victor Chang. He has a book that I'll actually recommend later on, where he has a 3 C's framework, but then he adds an extra bucket, product, to this framework. And this can be tailored to apply to a lot of different frameworks. I will say though that this is such a common, simple framework that, let's say you're given an interview and you go into the interview and use exactly this framework with no tailoring whatsoever for the problem given at hand. Although this is a useful framework, it doesn't really show independent thought, which is something that interviewers are definitely looking for, basically some creativity with the framework that you form in the first place. Mergers and acquisitions. Another useful framework where you're looking at the market, if it makes sense to do this acquisition, target the buyer. When you have an acquisition, different potential synergies or risks that may occur in doing an acquisition. For example, if you're American or German company that's acquiring a company in the U.S., maybe there's some synergies there, but other risks could be like the time difference, different things maybe with government regulations, depending on what your company is, what the product is. These are things worth taking into account, but at least you have this bucket set aside to kind of start analyzing certain aspects like that. Pricing framework. I always find these cases to be very fun because sometimes there's just a unique vantage point that you never thought of before once you start doing these kind of cases. When it comes to pricing a product, in the very least, you want to have the price higher than the cost, because otherwise you're losing money for every unit that you're selling. But then the other thing is maybe you can price and have large profit margins if you're a value-based, company where the value of your product is so much more than the cost itself. You can actually have large profit margins. Maybe you're trying to be competitive, and you know the pricing of your competitors, and you just want to be maybe undercut them price-wise accordingly. So then you have an idea of what your price should be for your product. And a lot of these, then there's some more qualitative things like, your overall strategy given, the company that you have, maybe the market share you're looking to achieve, things of that nature, more qualitative in nature. Reduce costs. This is a new one that I threw in there, which is, this is just a very generic framework. There's a myriad of different frameworks for reducing the cost of maybe for something in your business. Let's say it's a variable cost for material like, a colored paper, and there's 3 different buckets that, you want to look at for ways to reduce the cost of colored paper. You can reduce the need. You sell white paper and colored paper, but, your profit margins are very low with colored paper, or maybe it's actually you're losing money under colored paper. So maybe you want to eliminate colored paper as a product that you're selling. Or another thing would be reduce the dependence on it. Potentially, maybe there's a color of your colored paper that's just really expensive, and you want to start selling colored paper that's maybe less yellows and more reds, something of that nature. Reduce the need, maybe as you're producing colored paper, there's a lot of waste. Or when you're producing it, maybe you want to look at improving the productivity. Otherwise, maybe you want to renegotiate the cost of dye in that 3rd bucket, reducing the cost of the resource, or renegotiate with the suppliers to where maybe you have too many different suppliers, and then what you found out as you're going through the case is maybe you can all focus on having one supplier instead of many suppliers, and now you're getting a reduction in cost as a result of that, economies of scale. The last, framework that we can look into, response to a competitive threat. I always find these to be very interesting because there's just so many different competitive threat cases that can arise. In this case, there's 3 different buckets that you'd like to test. The first one being the impact on our business. The second one being opportunities to a competitive threat. And then lastly, possible responses given your understanding of the first 2 buckets. A little more detail in the first bucket. When you have a competitive threat, the first thing you're curious of is estimated losses that this may occur on your company. And then you can talk about, depending on what the case is, what those could actually come to fruition as. Maybe you want to concentrate on what segments are affected as a result of this. And then, when you come to, and then you may wonder, like, why did your competitor, for example, acquire another person and now they have greater market share? Like, what was the purpose of that acquisition? Were they trying to just increase their profit margins? Was it economies of scale? Or are they just looking to increase the revenues? Things of that nature. And then you can figure out an appropriate response accordingly. Maybe imitate what they do, mitigate maybe some of the issues that happen, collaborate with them instead if you realize you're not able to do anything immediately, given that what they've done in the first place. So there's a lot of interesting things when it comes to a framework like this and just a problem like this that you may have to tackle. So I touched on a lot of different frameworks. This is just one of so many, but the biggest takeaway is basically to when you come across a framework or a question, basically tailoring a framework. Sometimes it's a mixed match of a little bit of this framework, a little bit of that framework, to basically be mutually exclusive with what each bucket tackles, and then collectively exhaustive to where you're actually answering the question as you're going through this. And then, lastly, when it comes to case flow, this is also from session number 1. There's a typical process that you have, right, when you're going through a case. The first thing is, understand the question. I think that's actually probably the most important thing, is understanding the question. There's nothing worse than you have the question, and then you start tackling the problem, and then you realize once you finished your framework and you just spent, uh, I don't know, 2 minutes working on the framework. Every minute counts when you're working on your interview. You just spent 2 minutes working on your framework, and then you realize your framework was answering a different question than what the client actually wanted in the first place. So one of the first things is, after taking good notes, is clarify with the interviewer. This is what we want. This is what we want to do. Correct? And they're like, oh yes, this is what we want to do. Okay. And then you create your hypothesis, and then you create your framework based off of your initial hypothesis. And then that framework would be your initial approach. When it comes to your first initial questions that you ask, whether throughout the case or when you create your hypothesis, really good first questions are questions that inform your framework. And I think that's really key. Some people ask clarifying questions in the beginning of the case, which are questions that you're going to ask anyways when you present your framework. Questions that inform your framework are things like, well, what's the goal of our clients? If the goal of your client is to increase revenue, well, there's no point including costs in your framework, which would have been wasteful questions in the first place. If the goal of your client is market share, well, it makes sense to have different buckets to accomplish greater market share than would be if it was something else. Those are more fundamental questions to ask. At the very end of your case, and you want to do this before the time is up, you want to assert a conclusion. And that one's, obviously very important. The biggest thing would be, I would say, with your conclusion is you lead with your recommendation. And then when you make your recommendation, you'll have a couple of supporting points that you've learned throughout the case. I would recommend no more than 2 to 3 supporting points, and then follow up with next steps. And then lastly, maybe mention a few risks about your initial recommendation, if there are any. And that would be a very strong conclusion to where your interviewer would be impressed. With that in mind, before we start getting into study strategies going forward, does anyone have any questions after everything I just said?
Could you give maybe a concrete example of a premise we might have to do this based off of?
Sure. Think of a good one. So so you have an interviewer that asks you, what's your favorite city? And you say it's Pittsburgh. And then they're like, okay, well, you are looking to start a art store in Pittsburgh. Should you do it? Okay. And then you have your initial hypothesis. Yes, I should open a art store, but to know that I need to test, let's say, 3 different buckets. There might be more. The first bucket you would mention would be market attractiveness. Then you go through all the reasons or things about market attractiveness, like maybe the size of the market, competitors, market share that you think would be appropriate. Another bucket would be profitability. You have your costs and revenue, and then you want to break down your revenue and costs. Another bucket would be, because I'm thinking in real time, market attractiveness, profits, maybe risks and capabilities. The fact that do you have the funds to afford to create open an art store? Should you be worried about the online art places, things of that nature? And then maybe lastly would be how. Should I buy an art store outright? Should I start from scratch? Should I do a joint venture, maybe like pair up with a university? That's your framework. That's what you present. You go through the case. Maybe they give you some really useful information. Maybe they ask you some market sizing questions over the next 20 minutes. Eventually, you get to your conclusion. And then your conclusion would be something along the lines of, I would recommend that we open up an art store. And that's for 3 key reasons. Let's say in this case, what's that street that's near campus? That's down Forbes, and then you take a right and there's Starbucks. You guys know that street? It's really close to campus. When you go down Forbes, you take your right. There's that street. I forget the name of the street, but let's say it's just down Forbes, but it's in Oakland, right? So yes, I recommend we open up an art store. That's for three reasons. The first reason is that Pittsburgh is actually a very dense school or city full of universities with lots of art students. So we actually have it's a very attractive market for us to open up an art store. The second reason is that we actually have a lot of opportunities to do a joint venture with local universities to have a supply of art students to come to our art store. The third reason is we have a very attractive location to open up the art store, which would be Oakland, because it's near University of Pittsburgh with X number of students. We'd be, able to have a lot of different students as a result of that. These are great reasons. Next steps would be to investigate if there's a small art store we can acquire. That way we, maybe acquire all the art supplies while we're at it. Some risks would be, there's certainly risks. I'm thinking really quickly about all these things, but as you go through the case, there might be some interesting information that may come up as a potential risk. But when you give your conclusion, I was a little bit slower about that because I just thought about it real quick. This should take you maybe, a minute and a half for you to give your conclusion, or maybe even less than. Was that a good example? Was that helpful at all?
Yeah, that was helpful. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, so I mean, there's so many different types of cases that you may be doing in the future. So how to prepare for a case interview. I think, everyone here is in a fantastic position to start getting ready for casing. So, how to get started. The first thing I would recommend, there's just so many resources online to guide you through, what's expected from the case interview process and what different firms expect out of you as you're going through this. The two most popular books that I'm aware of that have been recommended to me by different consultants from various firms would be Case in Point and Case Interview Secrets. Case in Point, that one I think is Bain's favorite book to recommend when it comes to the book that you recommend to prep for. Case Interview Secrets. This is just a very popular book, I think, across the board. Case Interview Secrets, Victor Chang. He has a video series called Look Over My Shoulder. And I highly recommend Look Over My Shoulder. Otherwise, it's called LOMS, LOMS. And essentially, you're just listening to like 30 hours of people doing interviews. And then you have a person who does poorly on an interview, okay at an interview, and then exceptional on an interview. And it gives you an idea of how to present yourself with interviewee and interviewer-led cases as you're going through this. I know Hacking the Case Interview is very popular. I haven't read it, so I don't know too much about that, but I've read Case in Point and Case Interview Secrets. There's also more passive ways to kind of learn about consulting if you're interested in the field. A recent book that came out is Mavis, which was written by, I think, an MBB consultant. But essentially, it's a nonfiction book where the main character, acts just like what a consultant would act like to solve a problem with, or it's a fiction book, I'm sorry, I meant to say fiction book, where the main character solves a problem just like how a consultant would when it comes to a chemical plant. Another big thing that's expected out of you is, mental math, basically being really quick at, doing math in your head. And, for some people, you're great at, equations and everything else like that, but your whole life you've been babied by a calculator. You're going to have to, get a little bit used to basically being able to do math on the fly publicly and verbally do math and basically walk through the interviewer each step that you're doing as you're doing the math. So Secret to Mental Math, I recommend that book. If you want to get a little bit faster at being able to do maybe 2-digit multiplication in your head. So pretty useful. The other thing is online resources. So, there's Case Coach, caseinterview.com, Prep Lounge. All these sources have online uh, case books if you don't have access to those in the first place. The pyramid principle, that's actually really familiar. I've definitely heard people talk about that on YouTube. I'm not too familiar myself though with the pyramid principle, but I know it's talked about a lot. Uh, I would say though, by far the most popular resources though is the two I mentioned, Case in Point and Case Interview Secrets in regards to books. Thanks for the question though. So one thing I'll mention though, Case Coach, personally, out of all the resources, it costs money. It's about $120 for Case Coach, but the volume of resources that you have accessible to your fingertips is a lot. And for example, BCG, this is part of MBB, so you have McKinsey, Bain, BCG. BCG actually gives you a free 2 weeks before their interview because they use Case Coach as basically a standard of what's expected out of you leading up to your interview. So that's helpful. And I've seen other firms actually use excerpts for example cases, specifically from Case Coach, when they do their online sessions to teach other people, how to do a case. Everyone, we're already getting basically the same information you get anyways from maybe LEK or BCG with the basic fundamentals, just being here today. So, well, first, any other questions before I get to the next slide? Okay. So next slide. What's expected? All right. So, I think the first thing that's really important is quick math. So, simple things like, being able to multiply 7 times 45, 7 times 4, 280, 7 times 5, 35, so 35 plus 280, 315, and then being able to, I verbalize that, but just, be able to do math like that kind of fast. One of the things I recommend practicing is being able to, shortcuts for doing math. So for example, 25% of 75,000, you can do that a couple different ways. You can divide that by 2 twice, right, to get that number. Or you can do 10% and then add 10% together, and then from there do what 5% would be, which is half of 10%, and then add that in. So 37,500 would be divided in half, and then divided in half again, it'd be 18,750. And then you can do the other way I mentioned. Another thing is, maybe you're going to get a word. It would typically come in the form of a word problem. So, Europe's population is 740 million. By the year 2025, the European Union population is set to drop down to 700 million. What's the percent change of that, right? And then I think a number like that's a little more awkward. So, one of the things that you have to be strategic about is estimating, numbers where it makes sense. So if this is just a number and that's the last number you're going to use, and you're not going to use this number further on, just ask, am I allowed to make an estimation of what the value is? And it turns out in a lot of cases, they just expect you to make an estimation. So then it'll be in this case, personally, I know the difference between 740 and 700 million isn't that much. So I would say, okay, well, I know what 1 out of 70 is, because that would be, if I were to say it was 10 million instead over 70, I know what that is. Well, that's 0.014. Well, it's not 1 over 70, it would be actually 4 over 70. So I multiply the number by 4. Well, that's going to be 5.6. So I know it's 5.6%, really close to the right number. Well, I reduced 740 million down to 700 million. So I know it's a little bit less, but not by much. So I'm going to say 5.5 million, or I'm sorry, 5.5%. Turns out the real answer is 5.4%. So, it's really close. But that's how I would have gone about figuring out the number. So, that's just the math section. That takes a lot of practice. That's just going to come to you. But, one thing that's really important, we already kind of covered this with the framework, creative thinking and brainstorming. So, simple questions like how do we reduce costs? Well, the buckets that you may think of may come from your frameworks that you kind of, memorize. How do we grow the business? A brainstorming question that you may be asked in the middle of the case. Well, some of the buckets that may come to mind actually come from your frameworks. Uh, a really popular question, a variation of this question that you'll get is, without doing a Google search, how would you find data to help determine the market size of patients that need gastric bypass procedure? So actually, I'm gonna ask you all this. How would you go about finding the data needed to make a really good estimation of the market size of patients that need gastric bypass procedure in the U.S.? So I'll give you all like, I don't know, 30 seconds to think about this. And if anyone comes to mind already, just like chime in and throw out a suggestion, but I'll just give some time to think about it. So you're not allowed to Google search, gastric bypass procedures in the US, but let's say you have access to any public data that's available in the world. What kind of public data would you look for to make a educated guess for what the market size of patients that need gastric bypass procedure in the US? All right.
Hey, this is Daniel here.
Hey, Daniel.
Hear me?
Yep.
I would look at morbid obesity rates probably. I mean, that would be a data point I would look up, and then you could look up what are the different treatment options for morbid obesity, and how many of those are how often is gastric bypass basically suggested as a treatment option for morbid obesity.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. Certainly, if you look at obesity rates in the U.S., you can at least determine the upper bound of what gastric bypass procedure could be. So it's not going to be 200 million in the U.S., which is like 66% of the U.S. population. But whatever that number is for obesity rates, certainly it'll be a percentage of that. Now, I'm going to be a stickler and say, okay, you can't Google of the people with obesity rates who have who need gastric bypass procedure in the U.S., but that's a really good start. Is there any other, maybe ways that we can look at finding that data? So, for example, one thing you can do is, we know that the US is actually comparable in a lot of ways to Europe, especially with its makeup. Certainly we have higher obesity rates, but we can actually look at potentially just data from Europe and look at how many gastric bypass procedures that they need as a fraction of their population. And maybe based off of that, we can get a much more similar idea of what we'd otherwise be seeing in the U.S. And then maybe if we had an idea of what obesity rates are in the U.S. as a percentage more than otherwise we're seeing per capita in Europe, we could actually get a very educated guess of the market size of patients that need gastric bypass procedure per year. So this is a question where maybe they're wondering how to figure out pricing. How do we figure out the pricing? Well, we know what our competitors' pricings are. We see that readily available. Well, that could be a benchmark for getting data to help determine that. There's other things like estimation questions. How many baby cribs are sold each year in the U.S. And how many televisions are there in the U.S.? So the first one, what you want to do with the estimation question is you want to lay out your approach on how you calculate it, and then you go through that approach, calculating it for your interview. Now, next session, we're going to cover estimation questions in a lot more detail, so I'm not going to spend much time on it now, but estimation questions are really important. In fact, for some firms, they might just set aside a whole hour, or like 45 minutes or so, and they'll just ask you an estimation question. What's the market size for car airbags in the US each year, and a dollar amount? And then you spend 30 to 45 minutes just breaking down how you go about calculating that. And then you calculate it and you give the number, and then if you're within probably like 30% of the number or 20% of that number, the actual number, you did a good job estimating that market size. I think one of the biggest things that's more important when it comes to estimation questions is your approach and your assumptions that are built into estimating the market size. So I'll just give a quick example. How many baby cribs are sold in each year in the United States? That actually is a pretty easy estimation question. Well, we know what the US population size is, right? Let's just say it's 320 million. It's like closer to 330 million, maybe 340. And then let's say that, people are within the age range of 0 to 80 years old. If we take an even distribution, 80 goes into 320 million 4 times. So we can make an estimation saying that, okay, there's 4 million people, and each year that people are alive. So, I know that, okay, that means that there's at least 4 million babies that are born each year. So in the very least, the baby crib market's at least 4 million being sold each year. And then I would say it's a little bit more, maybe a baby crib breaks, maybe you need to buy another one for your kid, but I doubt you need more than 2 baby cribs over the course of a kid, between 0 and 3 years old. So I'd say that the market size is 5 to 6 million baby cribs each year. Relatively simple. Television's a little bit more difficult. Just for sake of time, I'm not going to jump into that, but it's a very similar approach with how you go about estimating that. Reading exhibits, I'm not going to get too much into this. We probably will set a session aside for going into exhibits. But basically being able to synthesize exhibits very quick, and then getting to the so what of exhibits. And then there's other potential things that you'll need to learn, but everything else I mentioned I think is a lot more important. Things like being able to quickly create slide decks for a presentation, so you can present those slide decks for an interview, and being able to quickly analyze Excel data. The Excel data I think is very niche. Some firms ask that during the interview process. The slide decks, some firms ask you to make a slide deck. All firms ask you to do a case session. So I think that's what's a little bit more important. The focus on when you're preparing for the interview at first. All right. So having a study schedule, getting ready for the interview. There's 4 stages of learning, any new skill, I would argue. The first stage being unconscious incompetence, basically not being aware you need to learn, and not being and being incompetent of what basically you don't know you need to learn in the first place. Stage 2 would be conscious incompetence. Basically, you're conscious of what you need to learn, but you're still not good at it. Then there's conscious competence. You know what you need to know, and you also know it. And then stage 4 would be unconscious competence, which is basically you're not even conscious of how good you are at the skill that you have at hand, right? So the secret to success for being good at casing is just practice, 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 practice. So, in that first stage, what I would argue is, just to get started, is to read one of those case interview books that I recommended earlier. And then beyond that, though, after reading one of those books, I would start something called a case journal. So a case journal is extremely important. It's a journal where basically every time you practice with a partner and you have some feedback or you realize there's some things you need to work on, you write down those things you need to work on. And in between sessions with your case partner, you do that. So, once you read the book, you're at stage 2, and you know how bad you are. You're just getting started. Everyone's new to things. Takes a little bit of practice. Go to that case journal, practice in between sessions. Eventually, you become very good at it. And then from there, it just becomes as automatic as breathing. One thing I would recommend would be, or just to kind of put in perspective, stage 2, just getting kind of decent at cases. Everyone's different, but I would say, maybe approximately 10 cases, that's kind of stage 2. Getting to stage 3, it's a huge spectrum. Could be anywhere between, 15 to 30 cases, even more. And then from there, just as automatic as breathing, it's a large spectrum again of where that is. I mean, everyone's very different. I've talked to people that have gotten offers with MBB and they've done less than 10 cases. They just had a really good business sense and they're really good at quick math. I know others have done over 100 cases over many months. Personally, I've been doing casing for a long time now, like almost a year, maybe actually a year at this point. So I've done probably about 70 plus cases in my time. But my suggestion, I would say anywhere between 25 and 50 cases is like a very healthy amount before an interview. And that's just my suggestion. Everyone's different. So, take that with a grain of salt. You know yourself more than anyone else does. So just to kind of give some numbers to get an idea of what to look for when it comes to casing. And I already kind of covered this, but in order to learn quickly, just practice in between the casing sessions. I know some people, they'll do so many cases, tens of cases, but then they never worked on that one thing they needed to work on. So it's still something they're working on 20 cases later, to where they're just not like the best that they can possibly could be because they just don't practice in between cases. It's kind of like taking a math test over and over again, but that's not how you get better between math tests. You need to study between your math tests so that you can do better the second time you take it. So things of that nature. Before I move on, which is kind of the last part of the slides, any questions? All right. So, one thing that I remember doing when I was, getting interviews with MBB and things of that nature was, I was still very busy with research, and, getting practice in can be relatively difficult. So the last thing I'd like to cover is basically a technique to get practice, virtually anywhere, whether you're walking, driving, jogging, do anything, just, being able to practice anytime, anywhere. So, 5 steps. First step being look around and notice something. It could be literally anything. And then create a question and build basically a case question around that something. And then try to mentally answer that question and focus in on it. And it could be any number of things. It could be estimation or brainstorming questions. Those are relatively simple to create a question for. But it could also be other things like a question where you need to create a framework or test a hypothesis for. So, I remember doing this, walking home from school, campus. I'll see a mower and I all of a sudden create a case question about a lawnmower as someone's mowing their lawn. And then that helps me practice just with any myriad number of things. I look at a car model. I think about that car model versus, like maybe Hyundai versus Ford, and then make a case around that. Here's an example that I have. So imagine this is actually a Google Maps image of San Francisco. And if you'll notice, there is a whole bunch of Starbucks, really densely packed here in this Google Maps image. So you're walking around town in San Francisco and you notice a Starbucks right across the street from one another, just 1 block away. And you find that to be kind of weird. This is where your consulting cap comes on. So, there's a bunch of questions you might ask yourself, to basically be able to practice on the fly. So, they can range between estimation, brainstorming, framework, hypothesis testing. So I'm gonna pause right now, and given that you just saw a Starbucks within a block of each other, what are some case questions that may come to mind? It could be any one of these 4 categories. And I'll give you all a minute to kind of think about it. If something comes to mind, just chime in. But yeah. Oh, and then just keep it simple. It doesn't have to be too complicated.
How many coffees get sold kind of per block in this area?
It's a really good one. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, I would say that would be probably a medium level difficulty question. It's a good one. So that'd be an estimation question.
If you had to put down another Starbucks in this area, where would you put it?
That's good too. Like maybe like the minimum distance that would make sense so that you're not cannibalizing cells between stores. And that would be probably a framework. You'd have to create a framework to help answer that question. There's like literally an infinite number of possible cases here, but I'll still let some more chime in here. All right, so yeah, technique to practice anywhere. So here's just a few more examples. How much cannibalization is there between two stores? There can be a brainstorming question, like that would have to be, you may have to have also a hypothesis to help explain this, but why did he open a second Starbucks just a block away? What's the meaning behind that? And then a hypothesis that may help you answer that brainstorming question would be, should Starbucks close down all duplicate stores that are open less than a block away from each other globally? And then I guess I said the framework for the hypothesis, but the hypothesis one would be, given the brainstorming question, with the Starbucks being so close to each other, how do you test the hypothesis that Starbucks should close one of these stores on the weekends when there's less demand? So, I think what makes sense to me, kind of thinking about intuitively, is that there's just so much demand anyways, going to work and things of that nature, maybe like lunch break, that there's high demand. So it actually makes sense to open up these Starbucks stores even with cannibalization. And then maybe it would make sense to close some of them down over the weekend because they're just not driving the same profits that they would be on the weekend otherwise. So, things to think about, literally when you're anywhere. Some sample guidelines, and this is the last slide here. Keep it simple. Basically, start off with like a very simple building block. The suggestions you guys threw out was, fantastic. And then from there, once you get really comfortable with, some of the questions you're asking, make it a little bit harder. So like, okay, so an easy one will be how much coffee does one Starbucks sell per day? Medium Starbucks stores, how many are there in the country? And then harder still would be estimate the profits of a particular Starbucks store. And then as you're doing this, I recommend that you actually persist, throughout the entire time. And don't just get lazy where this is kind of hard. Why did I think of this idea and just quit? Like actually, don't stop thinking about it until you solve it in your head. And it's okay to round numbers, and it doesn't have to be too precise. It's the effort that's put into it, and kind of getting your brain in that frame of mind is, I think, what's most important here. And then, just kind of remember loosely the step-by-step approach that you'd be doing anyways if you had a pen and paper in front of you. That way, it's just second nature when you get into that interview or you're doing the case prep otherwise. So, that's everything I have to talk about today. I hope you all enjoyed it. Well, before I go to the very last slide to talk about what's going to be coming on in the future, does anyone have any questions? It could be about consulting, it could be about case prep, whatever you want. All right. So last slide. So, we just gone through session 1 and session 2. What's last would be or what's next is going to be we're going to do estimation and then the behavioral interview process. That's going to be with Rebecca. That's going to be approximately a month away from now, so we have a little bit of time in between them. What I would recommend in the meantime is maybe looking at one of those two books, kind of look at what consulting is all about, and what kind of firms you may be interested in, what kind of industries that you might be interested in, to help inform your case prep going forward. That's everything I have for today. Yeah, thank you. All right, everyone. Well, have a nice day, okay?
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you so much.
Mm.